All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's panel on Senate Bill 403, a bill to end caste discrimination in California. My name is Tanuja Jane Gupta. I'm thrilled to be your moderator today. I am excited to talk about this bill and the proponents of it, the arguments around it, and really shine a light on a number of issues. So I first want to start by thanking our amazing sponsors, the National Association of Social Workers. Thank you so much for hosting the panel and lending your expertise. And I really want to thank the panelists who have given their time today. I will say in this journey around fighting for caste equity, I have met some amazing litigators, legislators, scholars, activists, and they're all on this panel today, or many of them are on this panel today. So rather than me rattling off their bios for 10 minutes straight and you never hearing from them, we're going to jump into today's panel. And along the way, each person will introduce themselves. So first and foremost, I will start with Senator Wahab. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Can you please tell us, for everyone joining here today, what is SB 403?
Definitely. Well, first, I just want to thank you guys for hosting this. I think it's important to have the conversation and explain exactly what we're trying to do. I am the senator for the Alameda County and Santa Clara County area. It's basically East Bay and South Bay. And SB 403 is very simple. It's basically to limit and stop discrimination on the basis of caste. It clarifies existing California civil rights law to explicitly include protection against discrimination based on one's caste. Doesn't matter if you're upper caste or lower caste, it is to protect all people from caste discrimination of any kind.
So, Senator, thank you for leading on this charge. I'm really curious, and if somebody was new to this space, if you could explain to them, why did you pick up this particular mantle? Why this fight, this topic?
Definitely. Honestly, it wasn't something that a lot of people talked about in regards to in the media or other legislators or anything like that. But in my district in particular, as I said, I represent the East Bay and South Bay. It's incredibly diverse. But when we went door to door during campaign season, when we spoke to individuals and community groups and entrepreneurs, and they talked about some of the discrimination they were facing, including more specifically, one thing that moved me the most was women that were being discriminated against and talked about disparagingly and much more. But when you take that into the reason why I call it a civil rights bill and a workers' rights bill and a women's rights bill is because it literally touches everything. When people shared with me what the caste system is in the United States and how it's being utilized against them and so much more, it was disheartening to see in the fact that it's not a widespread issue in the sense that it's not a mainstream issue. It's not talked about. It's not understood. And people really saw me as like a representative that would understand the issue better than most. And they talked about how when they wanted to defend themselves or they would complain to HR or they would actually try to file a police report or even a lawsuit, that it was often said that we don't understand this, how do you prove it? How do you look at it? So forth. And we know discrimination cases are hard to prove to begin with, right? Let alone something that is so nuanced and so misunderstood and not understood at all by the larger public, such as caste. So, it was one of the things I brought up, in November during our orientation is how can I bring up the civil rights bill? A lot of staff asked, what is caste? They had to Google it. And slowly but surely, more and more people were like, yeah, that's exactly something that we should protect, especially as our communities get more and more diverse. I often say that we need to go further and deeper to protect more people, including in our own communities, including in our API communities, and knowing that there is discrimination within communities of the same kind, right? So I think it's important. I think it's a 21st century civil rights bill. I think that we need to speak up and share our stories. And with this bill, I think more and more people are sharing their experience and lived experience without shame, without trauma, and really highlighting the need for this bill.
That's great to hear, Senator. And I think when you said, diversity, that means a diversity of viewpoints come along with it. It's not smooth sailing all the way. And we know this from many civil rights movements. So I understand that you have been perhaps received a deluge of calls, of visits, opinions. Can you talk a little bit about, you talked about who you heard from that was affected in the community. Can you talk about maybe opponents of this bill or the topic and what they've said, who you've met with?
Definitely. So we've actually, myself and my team have met with opponents of this bill prior to the introduction of this bill and after the introduction of this bill, including in the last Assembly Judiciary hearing. Right after the hearing, there were a number of people who not only are leading a recall effort against me, we had a phone conversation with a number of them, as well as people that represent other groups and other organizations that oppose this bill. So I've met with, the Coalition of Hindus of North America, the Hindu American Foundation, and many other informal groups of individuals. So I've always been very open to meeting the opposition and understanding kind of their viewpoint, because the goal for me is to make the policy better, to make the policy more substantial and balanced, right? And so we have amended the language from the very beginning, and I'm a freshman senator, so even this process is new, and we're continuing to incorporate input, and it's really just to protect more and more people, including people like Prem, who's here on the call as well. And I don't see that what happened to any person or any argument that I've seen so far. It's a lot of fear mongering, right? It's not based on facts. It's not based on actuality. And so we have a bunch of protected classes, including, protected classes based on race and sex and age and much more. And all of these groups, they're working, they're thriving, they're living here protected. And we want the same thing with caste. It's not going to harm the community. In fact, it's going to protect the community even further. And I just want to make that very clear.
Got it. And I'm glad you said very specifically the impact to specific individuals and what they've experienced, because Prem, let me turn to you now. You are someone who has spoken out about caste discrimination, what you faced personally in this country, as well as speaking out on behalf of the broader community. If you don't mind, could you just give a little bit of background of who you are, what you're doing today, and kind of your experience with caste discrimination here in America?
Thank you, Tanuja, for this wonderful question. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to Senator Aisha Wahab, her staff, and all the supporters who introduced and supported this bill, being courageous and brave to protect caste-oppressed Californians. So it has more than 3,000 years of history. And SB 403 is an important bill for California, as it aims to address and stop caste discrimination, which is a form of social discrimination based on one's caste. The bill recognizes that caste discrimination is a pressing issue that impacts individuals and communities, particularly in the South Asian diaspora. And so Senator Wahab also talked a lot about caste discrimination bill. So so let me talk my personal experience. So when I came in this beautiful country in 2015 to flee caste apartheid, so I was struggling to find a job, honestly. And at that time, so my caste was the barrier. Luckily, I got connected to one restaurant. And in the restaurant, so what happened that was Indian restaurant. And generally in restaurant, the restaurant owner, they would provide shared housing for the workers. And I was one of them, but my co-workers who were from dominant caste, they refused to share that shared housing with me. They refused to share that room because of my caste. They openly said Prem, sorry, we don't we don't feel comfortable. I did not say anything that time because facing caste discrimination was not new at that time. I have been facing this caste discrimination from my childhood. And the same thing I faced here at my workplace. I was I was like, I was compelled to live in RV van like almost like 1 month.
Mm.
So I was not safe at that time. I changed that place. I got another job in another restaurant, Nepali restaurant. The same thing I faced. I had to face casteist slurs. I had to face casteist slurs from my coworkers. When I reported that to my boss, and he openly said that, sorry, Prem, I cannot help you. Because like, you are undocumented here, right? You don't
Mm.
have like immigration status as well. And you like, so these people are working here for longer. And I don't want them to go just to keep you here. You can find job in another place. When I heard that very irresponsible answer from my boss, I was very devastated at that time. I left job in restaurant. I started to work in warehouse. I don't want to say the name of that, that renowned company. So when I was in warehouse, so I saw many Nepalese like worker there, South Asian worker, Indian, Nepalese, and some other like, it was diverse community. And so one of our co-workers was celebrating birthday within like, within like staff. We were celebrating birthday outside of the company. I mean like at the premises of the company. And everybody was just like, they were happy and they were receiving cake. When it was my turn, the birthday lady, she stopped me to toss that cake. Prem, stop them. Stop touching that cake. I will prepare a plate for you. Can you imagine? In front of everyone, in front of every coworkers, I was humiliated. I was insulted. After that, I just saw everyone's face. So no, everyone was disappointed, but nobody dared to speak any single words. This is
Mm.
wrong. Nobody said that. And I immediately left that place. I did not report that incident to my HR because I know, because I was looking that, California, that, announcement, but I did not see caste in the protected category. This is the real thing. I'm not just like, I'm not just making stories. This is the real thing. When I shared my experience with another caste oppressed coworkers, he also shared the similar kinds of experience. Prem, I do have the similar experience. At workplace,
Mm.
I don't want to talk about the place of worship. I have faced that discrimination and other caste oppressed community members also. Nobody dared to talk about their personal experience because my community members, most of my community members, they are struggling with immigration status. They don't want to take risk, right? So it is better. They always feel like, to be quiet. Remaining silent or quiet is the solution. They think that. But when I went to school at CSU Eastway, I did feel the similar kinds of microaggressions within my classroom. When I introduced myself as caste oppressed student in the social work department, so my other South Asian colleagues, they invalidated my experience. They openly said, oh, I never heard about caste discrimination. I never, I don't know. Those who are coming
Mm.
like, like India, from Nepal. But after that conversations, some of them started to distance with me. They started to distance with me. And I faced like, other uh, I do have I have so many, incidents of facing
Yeah.
caste discrimination. I cannot say within this limited time, but I have mentioned my personal experience in my op-ed also. Many of you have read those experiences. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely. I really think if anybody ever doubts that this is real in any forum, whether it's housing, employment, education, public spaces, what has happened to you is proof that this will continue unless somebody stands up, until there is a law against it, there's some remedy. And I am very curious, you mentioned that and that other people were denying that caste exists or that such discrimination exists here. But I think one thing that different people sometimes don't get is that while you immigrated knowing your caste or what the caste was that was ascribed to you, a second generation American born here may not know his or her or their caste background, right? And so that reaction may be genuine to say that they don't know it, but it doesn't quite tell the story that they think it's telling. Can you talk a little bit about this phenomenon and kind of how you reconcile that with your experiences?
certainly. I would be happy to talk about this. So no one has learned caste discrimination from their birth, right? So we learn from the society and practice them in our day-to-day life. So let me explain why a second generation American from South Asian American from an immigrant parent may be born in this country without knowing their caste background. The knowledge of one's caste background is often tied to cultural and social practices that are deeply rooted in the country of origin. When immigrants move to a new country, they may adopt to a new cultural norms and practice while also experiencing a sense of disconnection from their ancestral traditions, including the detailed knowledge of caste. In the case of second generation Americans born to immigrant parents, their upbringings and cultural exposure often reflect a blend of their parents' cultural heritage and the American cultural context they grow up in. So these individuals may not have the same levels of familiarity or direct connection to the caste system as their parents. So while some parents may pass on aspects of their caste identity and traditions to their children, it is not always the case. So parents may choose to prioritize shaping their child's identity based on the values and opportunities presented by their new country. So this can lead to a lesser emphasis on caste awareness or even a deliberate choice to shield their children from impact of caste-based discrimination by not transmitting specific knowledge about their caste background. Additionally, the caste system itself is complex with, with many subcastes, regional variations, and so many other regions. Even within the same caste, there can be significant differences in cultural practices and social hierarchy from one region to another. So this complexity can make it challenging to maintain and transmit a comprehensive understanding of one's caste background across generations. Having said that, I would like to highlight that within South Asian diaspora, the Indian American diaspora has a longer history than other South Asian diaspora. For example, Nepali American diaspora does not have a long history of immigration to this country.
Mm.
If you see the data, South Asian immigrants are the fastest growing community. Many Nepalese are the first generation in this country. You can take my example. I am the first generation. I do not have longer history, right? So with diversity visa, like many Nepalese are landing in the United States airport at this time, right? So in the name of preserving culture and traditions and language, so people are preserving the caste system too. So if you go to new place, people often ask you caste first. If you forget or don't want to say your last name, they will ask your last name to identify your caste identity. This is the fact of my community. This is the real fact of my community. I'm talking about Nepali community. As a social worker, I have to work with South Asian communities here in California. Even dominant caste colleagues had told me that they were asked their caste identity when they have unknown or like unique last name, unheard, last name. So people ask to go deeper and deeper. This is not the case of Indian community. Like Bhutanese community also has the same thing. If you see Burmese community whose previous origin was Nepal, there is also the same situation. The Bangladeshi American community, Pakistani American community, they have the similar situation. Last week, I attended one national conference in LA. And when I was talking about my personal experience, so many other South Asian colleagues from Bangladeshi Americans, Pakistani Americans, even Indian Americans and Nepali Americans community, like participants, they were like, this is the truth. This is the truth. Prem, what you are experiencing, we have witnessed that at my workplace, in my community setting, I have been seeing that. They validated my experience. And
Absolutely.
what I'm sharing now, this is my personal experience. Sorry, Tanuja, I took a little bit.
No, you don't need to apologize. I think it's important to take a beat to really kind of synthesize that, because you've answered that question almost in 2 to 3-fold. First, when I ask a question about a second generation South Asian, you've correctly kind of clapped back and said, well, South Asian is a pretty broad community and there's a lot of diversity within that. So it's hard to answer such a question kind of on that level. The second thing is, to your point, that a lot of times what second generations are told are their culture are really practices of a certain caste background that are considered now normalized as part of culture. And a second generation may not realize, like, oh, everyone doesn't do that. I didn't realize that. I thought that was just the Indian thing to do, and I think we could probably look no further than some pop culture. If anyone out there has watched the Indian matchmaking TV show, where we can see that caste is well and alive and spoken of, right? And so people who may not know their caste background, it's probably a good indicator of some privilege. People who are familiar with their caste background, it's probably a good indicator of some trauma that they've experienced because of their caste background. And I say their caste background, and Darina is the lawyer on this call, and she will probably correct me later, that it's not just their actual background, it's their perceived background. And that makes a huge difference, because it doesn't matter what I actually am, it's what you think I am and how you treat me differently because of that, in either way. So I wanted, you mentioned also the religious institutions, and you yourself are a practicing Hindu, and that's why I am glad that Sapna has joined us on tonight's call. Prem is a practicing Hindu, but some people tend to think that speaking out against caste discrimination is anti-Hindu. And as a Pandit yourself, can you talk a little bit about how you practice a very progressive feminist version of Hinduism? Can you help us reconcile these schools of thought, and maybe first explain what a Panditya is?
Yes, I can start with that for sure. And also thank you. And thank you so much, Prem, for your honesty, your bravery, for sharing all the experiences that you've gone through yourself. And also to Senator Wahab for your leadership in bringing this bill around. So yes, let me start with this term, Pandit, right? And we hear it also in popular culture now. Everyone's I don't know, this person can be like a macaroni and cheese pundit, apparently. That term has become very widespread. And, technically speaking, the word pandit comes from the Sanskrit root pand, which just means to collect. And in that context, it means to collect knowledge. And so really a pandit, and the way it's used in popular culture, and I say pandita as a female identified person, is someone who is a learned person, an educated person, somebody who collects knowledge or specializes in knowledge, right? That term, pandit or pandita, does often get kind of translated into English as priest, but it doesn't necessarily have to be priest. It could be somebody who's a scholar, somebody who is an expert in that particular area. And in terms of where did I collect my knowledge from, I collected from personal sources as well as some educational professional sources. I would say that the origins probably of my knowledge collection in what it is to be Hindu, it goes back to what Prem was saying, honestly. I'm also second generation. I was born in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm based now. And I got my definition of what is Hinduism from my elders, from my grandparents, from my parents, from my dance gurus. And that's where it began, right? And I was fortunate to be given a definition of Hinduism that tells me that one should not discriminate, that one should see the entire world as one family. And I'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, it was especially my grandfather who studied also religion and religious practice and was a pandit, was a officiant, was actually a purohit is the term that's used for somebody who's a priest, really, and performed Hindu rituals when he was alive up and down the East Coast. And I used to follow him as a child and kind of observe him. And I was curious. I was always very curious because I had some interest in what are you doing and why are you doing it and what does it mean? And I would ask a million questions as he's doing all of that. And that curiosity probably led me to then want to study Hinduism in further depth when I was in college. To be completely honest, I actually took my first Hinduism class as thinking it would be an easy A, because I'm like, I'm Hindu. I'm going to take a class in Intro to Hinduism. I've got this in the bag. And my professor, Dr. Balaji Hebbar, who is still at GW University and some other local universities, definitely did not kind of give me an easy A. It was a very rigorous course, and it was then it became from just a class in Hinduism to becoming I pursuing an entire bachelor's degree in focusing in specifically Vedantic Hinduism and Islam, and looking at the spiritual reasons behind certain rituals. Because as I said, my grandfather was a purohit. I used to observe the ritual aspect. My father also is a practicing Hindu doing the ritual aspect. But I was curious about the why, the history, the where does it come from? What does it mean? The symbolism and all of that. And so that's really what I was focusing on and studying. So that's what it means to me to be a pandit and a pandita. I do officiate. I do some purohita work, if you will, as well, in the sense that I do also conduct religious ritual. I do weddings in particular, and I also conduct some other Hindu ritual. But, as I said, there's some educational background there, studying under these theologians like Balaji Hebbar. There's personal, and the personal experience too, I want to say also somebody can tell, as you just talked about perceived caste, right? In South Asia, one's last name gives you everything you need to know apparently about that person, or so one thinks. And so oftentimes I've heard it myself so many times where they're have said, oh, you're a Pandya, that means you're a Brahmin. They know immediately what my caste is, right? And so whether that is, a discrimination in the sense of like, I may be treated differently because of what they now think of me because of my last name. Again, I'll leave that to the legal experts for, but the point being that it's hard to hide. It's hard to hide because it comes in one's name if one uses the name from one's family. So yes, I come from a Brahmin family. As Prem mentioned, there's a lot of diversity within that as well. And my mother's Brahmin subcaste practices different things, such as eating non-vegetarian food, whereas my father's Brahmin caste eats only vegetarian food. So those, just a simple example of how there's that diversity in practice as well. And then the last thing I'll say, as far as like, where does my expertise or where does my pandita-ness come from? It is born out of my love of social justice, to be honest. And that justice, that origin of social justice, I actually find in my study of Hinduism, right? And I can talk more about that. But I did a lot of community. I do still do community organizing work with South Asian communities on the East Coast. And that's really where I've collected knowledge, because I believe people are the ones that I can learn from the most. People like Prem, who are brave enough to share their stories. That's where I learn, and that's where I continue to collect knowledge about what does it mean to be Hindu? How are different people also defining and practicing what it means to be Hindu?
So that's very helpful. And I'm glad to hear how you've been able to kind of reconcile your faith and your practice with the fight for caste equity as well. And so I think you're the perfect person for somebody who is kind of new to this fight completely and is on this call and kind of triangulating their way into understanding this issue. How would you describe the South Asian caste system to someone who's not familiar with it and its ties to the religion of Hinduism and how it's evolved? Because there's a lot of myths out there that the caste system started with like British rulers and things like that, which is a very unnuanced way of understanding the British Raj influence on the caste system. So
Absolutely.
can you talk a little bit about that and give us a scholarly lesson?
I can try it. I will try not to be too academic-y about it, but the first time that you hear what then now has become the castes as they are now referred to, the first reference of that historically is considered back in the Rig Veda, which is one of the original texts, if you will, of Hinduism. And there's mention in there, the term that's used in the Rig Veda is actually varna and not caste. That is not a Sanskrit word, caste. I will say that it is not a Sanskrit word, caste. People actually say that it comes from maybe Portuguese or Spanish, the casta, the classes. But it's definitely there's a tie because these terms are in the Rig Veda of a Brahmin, of a Shudra, of a Vaishya. Those names, those words are in the Rig Veda, right? And there's a famous verse in particular that is often quoted by theologians as this is the origin of caste, which is a verse on Purusha or human. And it says that of the human or of the Purusha, the mouth became the Brahmin, the shoulders became the word in the Rig Veda is Ranja, which became later Kshatriya, which is considered the warrior class. I can complicate that later. The thighs became the Vaishya, or what is considered the merchant class, and the feet became the Shudra, right? And that's what the verse says. What happened later, because the Vedas are like the oldest original text.
Before you go into that, I just want to make sure, so anybody listening, right, that you can kind of get it from the body part equivalency, but those are what are considered the biggest rungs on the ladder of caste, right, with Brahmins at the top and then working your way down, which then translates to a lessening of civil rights, public rights, everything. Yeah, so keep going.
Absolutely. And so, and that's actually what I was going to get to in terms of the laddering thing, that actually even the way that it was taught to me was not necessary that the feet are less than the head, right? That concept and that sense that the feet necessarily are somehow impure, dirty, the bottom, etc. That is something that came about in Hindu society for sure. I am not going to deny that. However, in the text itself, and again, the way it was explained to me was you need the thighs and the feet to hold up society. That is actually the most important part. And so you require all parts of the body in order to function. And that is why the human has those 4 different parts, right? Is that all 4 are necessary to function. It was then so you have those texts, the Vedas, which are considered the Shruti or the heard texts, the ones that were not written because they were told by mouth, by people long ago. Then you have texts that are written. And of course, the most infamous, I will say, is the Manusmriti. And the Manusmriti, or the law, or the code of Manu, as it's referred to in English, in that's where it's decided that the parts of the body that are above the navel are supposed to be the pure parts, and the parts of the body that are below the navel are considered impure parts, right? And so that's where you start to see the stratification. So I want to make that distinction between defining caste, again, Varna, which those became caste later, defining caste or the origins of what is caste versus the origins of caste discrimination, which the Manusmriti, which is also an old text, but a written text by people, by humans that we can name and know that lived as historical beings, that, and there's a lot of problematic things in the Code of Manu, but this is just one that really does talk about this distinction of what are the pure and what are the impure, and also how the pure should be treated versus how the impure should be treated. And again, there are other theologians besides my professor, besides Hebbar, who have studied this. There's another famous professor out of UT Austin, Professor Olivelle, and he talks about how really in the Vedas, it talks about how any of the four could attain purity or impurity by the content of their character. It's about actions or innocence. So the way that caste system and caste discrimination is practiced in Hindu society, and as Prem mentioned, in other South Asian communities as well, is that there are some that you are born into this caste and that it can never be changed. It can never be you can never get out of that caste. That's the way it's practiced. That's the way that we see it today, right? However, that's not necessarily what's found in the Vedas. In the Vedas, the classification is based on one's character rather than their birth. And so this kind of, what do you call it, bastardization really of became happened later. And I mean, I'm not going to let the British off the hook. I mean, the British definitely used this, right? They didn't come up with it, but they definitely used it, and they used the Code of Manu for many things to subjugate different Indian citizens at the time. This is, of course, colonial India, pre-South Asia as such. They used the Code of Manu to justify the different stratifications that they used because they had to divide and conquer as well, right? So, so they did absolutely use that as a basis to further the caste discrimination. And I do also want to talk about, like, I completely appreciate why people may not have heard of it. I remember being asked when I was a kid, though. Like, I remember being asked even as in elementary and middle school, maybe not elementary, but like, so what's caste, right? What does it mean?
Yeah.
And my definition then was like, well, I mean, every society has some way of treating some people good and some people bad. And unfortunately, that has become part of human condition, the part of the human condition. It should not be so, but that is that is true, and I used to say that to my classmates then.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think one of the arguments or the worries that people have when they are on the fence of whether or not to support this bill, SB 403, is that they worry that their kids are going to be discriminated against in school because they will be associated with the caste system and will be asked this question of what's your caste, things like that. And so can you talk to a little bit of, like, for the parents listening, how they should think about this when they think about their kids' future?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I also want to tie this back into your earlier question or your earlier statement about how this bill is considered somehow anti-Hindu. Because I think, I mean, I'm as a practicing Hindu, and I'm a little confused because it's an anti-caste discrimination law. I don't read anything in here as anti-Hindu. I read it as anti-caste discrimination, which, if you're saying it's anti-Hindu, you're kind of suggesting that caste discrimination is supposed to be part of being Hindu, right? So to me, it's a little confusing if people are saying that it's anti-Hindu, because is that what you mean to say? Do you mean to say that, that to be Hindu, you must discriminate on the basis of caste? Because again, as I said, that's not what I was taught, right? That is not my Hinduism. My Hinduism is not about discrimination. Mine is about, there's a famous verse, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. It means the entire world is one family. That's, I remember learning that from my dance gurus, like when I was 10, 11 years old. The world is one family, the entire, and that is how it's my extended human family. That's how it should be seen. And so I think I'm just, I'm confused about that. And honestly, that's one of the things that I would even say to the parents, and I'm myself a parent of a 5-year-old, and this might come up, when she's in school as well, that somebody says, well, what is this? What is caste? And I hope that she will, know to say, well, we don't do that. That's not something that I know to do she's Hindu and Muslim identified, but that's not something that my family does, because that's not how we see our Hinduism and Islam. Ours is about seeing all members of society as part of the human family, right? And that parents can prepare their children in that way. If a kid is getting that sense, then they're getting it from their parents, that they're supposed to be treating people this way. As Prem said earlier as well, that's what defines one's practice of a religion, right? And I think that's also what's confusing. It's like what's written, I know earlier I gave the answer of like what's written in text and scripture, but that's always different than how it's practiced, as I already pointed out. Like, you know, the way caste discrimination is practiced and played out, but that is important. I don't want to downplay that. How it's practiced is very important because real people are hurt by the practice of it. Real people are not necessarily hurt by what's written in word and in text and put, you know, away somewhere. And so the practice is extremely important. But yeah, I would say that, you know, one of the keys to passing this bill is that it should result hopefully in a greater awareness of what caste discrimination actually is and what it can look like, and the fact that it should not continue. Just like Prem mentioned, every other type of a category that is protected. You're protected on your race, your gender, your color of skin, your sexual orientation. It should protect against anything that one is perceived to be and so to that extent, kids that are experiencing caste discrimination, which is a real thing. I mean, as Prem talked about his own experience as an adult, but children are also facing that. And I can say that, if I may, as an upper caste person, because I hear it in my community, right? Like, not thankfully from my parents and my elders, but I definitely grew up with hearing it, not being on the receiving end of it, but rather on the end of people saying, oh yeah, like those people shouldn't come because they're from such and such family or background. Or as Prem said, these glasses are for these people, but when you know, those folks come over, we put these glasses for them, you know, and separation of utensils and cutlery and things like that. Or I don't know, one of the biggest things for me is that when my wife and I were planning to start a family, we started looking into adoption. And I remember hearing from people in my community, especially upper caste people, well, you have to be careful because you don't know where the child has come from. And you know what they were trying to say is, be careful, you might get a kid who was born into a non-upper caste family, right?
Right.
And so that is very real. It's absolutely there. And so kids who are presently experiencing, or families that are experiencing that kind of caste discrimination, hopefully they'll learn more about what it is and learn about how to stand up against it and learn about their rights and learn about the fact that they have a resource, and not have to go through what Prem went through, right? Like, but actually have a chance to say, this person said XYZ about my family or my last name, and I shouldn't be treated that way. That's not right. That shouldn't continue. So I hope that that's what, like my daughter, I hope that other kids would know to say that I shouldn't be treated badly because of XYZ. Whatever that XYZ is, including caste, should be a part of that.
No, absolutely. And I think that you hit the nail on the head in terms of, because I want to segue to some of the legal parts of what are those rights and how do you enforce them? How do we make sure that everyone can avail themselves of this law? And I think to answer that question, I'd like to turn to you, Tharina, now. If you're a litigator, I would love for you to share a little bit of your background and what you've seen. Like, how would this actually play out in terms of the legal sphere if you were to assert your right to not be discriminated against based on your caste? How does that work?
Yeah, so right now, caste is not expressly enumerated as a protected category in the law, right? So to understand this, we can look at the Cisco case. And in that case, the California Civil Rights Department filed a lawsuit against the tech giant for alleging that upper caste employees had created a hostile work environment for lower caste counterparts. Now, because caste is not expressly enumerated, Cisco was sued under existing protections like religion, ancestry, national origin, and race. However, the judge in that case denied the admission of evidence related to caste, and this is the perfect example why courts would be reluctant, and it shows that courts will be reluctant to admit evidence related to caste, even if it's relevant to the case, right? So this, as you can imagine, would make it more difficult for victims to prove that they were discriminated against on the basis of caste, just like it was in the Cisco case. It's also important to note that because of the nature of the discrimination, plaintiffs can prefer to proceed under a pseudonym. So like in Cisco, the plaintiff, we call him John Doe, was concerned about the backlash and the violence that his family residing in India would face if he revealed his name publicly. So he proceeded under the name John Doe. And before you can file a case for caste discrimination in court, you have to get a right to sue letter from the California Civil Rights Department. As of right now, caste does not appear on the form whatsoever. So what SB 403 would do, it would expressly define and include caste as a subset of ancestry, which is already protected, and making it a protected category. This would be included in under a Civil Rights Act, the Fair Employment and Housing Act, and the Education Code. The implementation of this would be exactly like other protected categories, similar to protecting Californians from religious discrimination, race discrimination, gender discrimination. Also, SB 403 would result in caste being expressly appearing on the right to sue form, right? So this would help administrative departments like HRs, the HR departments, and attorneys and judges to better help advocate for victims of caste discrimination.
So I'm glad you laid it out, because the devil's in the details. So it was very nice to understand kind of exactly how this would play out in the court system. I think, in addition to the complex litigation work that you do at Dixon and Diab, you're also the Racial Justice Equity Chair for the South Asian Bar Association, and you were the president for the San Diego Bar Association as well. And I feel that all led to your deeper understanding that made you kind of one of the key witnesses at the most recent Assembly Judiciary Committee hearing, where you had a very tough job of not only explaining the legal nuances of this bill and how it would work, but you also had to do a lot of myth busting in a short period of time. And I was hoping we could talk a little bit about those myths today for anyone listening that may hear them in conversation and not really have kind of the arsenal at their fingertips to counter in the moment. One of the biggest myths, I think, is this idea that this bill is not facially neutral, that it stereotypes. Talk to us about what that means, why it's not true.
Yeah, so like I said before, SB 403 would add caste as a subset of ancestry, right? So there's nothing in the bill that singles out or discriminates against a particular community or group. Caste, like we've said, is a global issue that affects many communities, including from Japan, Somalia, South Asia, Nigeria. There's nothing in the bill that discriminates against one of these communities or faiths. It's a facially neutral amendment that would protect everyone in our society from caste discrimination.
So when we talk about equal protection, this goes kind of both ways, or like how would you kind of give that to someone so that they could understand that they're protected no matter which area they fall in?
Yeah, so some people are saying this would protect only lower caste people, and that's not true, right? So to give an example, let's say the supervisor at an employment agency or at a firm is someone of lower caste, right? And then you hire someone new who's actually upper caste person. If the supervisor who is lower caste discriminates against the person who is lower caste, SB 403, the anti-caste discrimination bill, would protect that person, would protect that higher caste person, right? So the shield works both ways. Everyone's protected from caste discrimination. It's not just one person or one category of people.
Absolutely. And I think that, the last one that I've heard you kind of had to counter is this idea, well, if we enumerate caste specifically, then everybody now has to declare what their caste is, or how they practice it, and they don't want to talk about it in job interviews. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think this is the saddest one, right? So SB 403 is not going to force anyone to do anything. Nobody's required to declare a part of that identity that they're not comfortable doing. All SB 403 does is create a clear avenue to bring a lawsuit for discrimination, right? So if someone asks you about your caste at your job, your school, or while trying to get housing, you can refuse to answer that question. And then if you get fired, or if you don't get the job, or you get demoted, or any other adverse action is taken on you based on you revealing what caste you are, SB 403 allows you to bring a lawsuit for caste discrimination. And on top of that, if you're not comfortable still releasing your caste publicly, you can proceed under a pseudonym, right? So you can proceed under Jane Doe, you can proceed under John Doe. So just like you cannot be required to disclose your religion at work or at school or your sexual preference, the same is true for caste. No one is allowed to ask you at school or during a job interview about your caste.
Perfect. Thank you so much for weighing in on this and kind of setting the record straight. I know we are coming up on the hour now, and we budgeted a little bit of extra time to make sure we could talk about what do you do with all this knowledge? You know, where is SB 403 now? How can you jump in the fight and help us move this bill forward? So I wanted to direct your attention to a slide that's coming up in presentation mode in a minute of what you can do, because there's a lot you can, and it makes a real difference. And so the first thing is to write a letter of support. It probably sounds arcane. You're like, oh my God, these letters, where do they even go? But I kid you not, they are counted, they are looked at. The letters of support and their authors are enumerated in internal reports across legislators and staffers to see where people are coming in. It makes a difference. What you can see up here on the slide, and hopefully everyone can see here, it's callegislation.ic.ca.gov/advocates. There is a portal. It's a formal portal where letters of support can be submitted, and you should do this. You can submit letters as an individual. You can do it on behalf of your own organization, a bar association, a workers association, a union, a group of concerned citizens from a particular community, a temple board, anything, really. You can come together and do it. And so that's the first thing to do, write your letter of support. The second thing you can do is call your assembly representative. So Senator Wahab mentioned that the bill has kind of made its way through the legislature. It's passed the California Senate. It's now in the California Assembly. So call your assembly members. There's an eventual reconciliation where all of the legislators across both Senate and Senate and Assembly need to be voting on the same text. So call your representatives, both in the Senate and in the Assembly, to make sure they know you support SB 403, and they should too. And then I think the last most important thing is thank your senator and your assembly member when you do see them support the bill. You know, a lot of times it's easy to yell at people, but not to give praise. And so you wonder, you're like, am I fighting the right fight? I only hear things when I'm not doing X. So saying thank you and recognizing that standing up for this fight is important is a huge part of this. So definitely get involved. You are welcome to, email the address that was on the site if you have any questions. And we really thank you for joining us tonight, and we'll try to give you back some time so everybody can get to dinner. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much to our hosts, the National Association of Social Workers. And thank you to the audience for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you. All our best.